My journey, as noted, in the field of women's leadership began 30 years ago with the research, the project that became the book, The Female Advantage: Women's Ways of Leadership, which I am still proud to say was the first book that focused on what women had to contribute to organizations rather than how they needed to change and adapt. The book came very much out of my personal experience. I'd been in the work world for a while during the 70s and certainly the 80s. I'd been in journalism and then found myself in corporate communications, doing a lot of speech writing. And I was fascinated by there were very few women around me, and I was fascinated by what did I need to know, what did I need to do in order to be successful. So there not being many women around, I started reading some of the books that had been written, both popular and academic, for women in the workplace throughout the 1980s. And I learned a lot, but what I kept finding was that everything I read had a negative focus. We hadn't played football, so we didn't understand teamwork. We couldn't participate on the golf course with the guy. Whatever it was, we didn't view business as a game. It was all these supposed handicaps or disadvantages that women brought to the workplace. And what we needed to do was to leave our values and what we thought might be our own particular skills at home. If it moves, salute it, you're in the Army now, and adapt to the leadership style that we saw. One thing I've learned subsequently is that women provide a fabulous market for books about what is wrong with them. Men do not. There's a woman who wrote a book called 10 Stupid Things Women Do to Mess Up Their Lives. It was a massive bestseller, could even be in the bookstore. She had the very bad idea of following it up with a book, 10 Stupid Things Men Do to Mess Up Their Lives. It sold about 45 copies. And I'm sure they were all to women who gave it to their husband who then didn't read it. But we provide this kind of market we're avid learners about what's wrong with us. I saw up at the Omega bookstore this section on women and women in change and women in transformation went on bookshelf after bookshelf. Then over in a corner, there were about 4 books for men on transformation. We are an avid market. We are self-improvers, and we want to know. But we don't need a negative message. And what seemed very clear to me in the late 80s, before there was even a clue about what the technology on the horizon would do in terms of transformation, is that we were moving into a different time, and that if women got the message that all they needed to do was change and adapt to the way organizations had been run throughout the industrial era, we would miss not only an opportunity to thrive based on what we had to offer and our own, as you've heard all morning, authentic capabilities, but we would also miss an opportunity to be part of change that organizations sorely needed. So I decided what I wanted to do was to study some of America's most successful women leaders and try to learn how they did things. I would have done it globally, but no publisher was interested in supplying that kind of budget. So I did a lot of background interviews, but I did diary studies of 4 women leaders, which means I followed them around except when they went to the ladies' room. I was on their tail the entire time because I wanted to document what they did. The women I studied were very different. They were a different age, different ethnicity, different sectors, different regions, but they had certain things in common that I documented and then tried to draw together. 5 things stood out to me. First of all, the women I studied placed a high value on relationships. Not only their own relationships with others, but they wanted to cultivate organizations in which good relationships could thrive. The women had a bias for direct communication rather than communication up and down a chain of command. They liked to talk to the person that was concerned directly with an issue rather than filter down the information and let it be filtered out to them. The women tended, as a corollary to this, to put themselves in the center of things in their organizations rather than at the top. And sometimes this was literal. There were two of the women who had positioned their office actually in the center of the floor that their organization primarily worked on, which was very different than what I'd seen in corporate communications, which is people up on the 40th floor, the senior executives, wondering why they lost touch with the people on the 25th. Seems obvious. But the women liked to put themselves in the center of things. They were comfortable with, as opposed to tolerant of, diversity. They themselves had been outsiders. So on one hand, they understood the kind of value that a fresh perspective could provide and bring. And on the other, they knew in their bones what condescending behavior and expectations felt like, and did not want to spread that around. And fifth, the women were very skilled at integrating their personal lives and their lives at work. They made the point, every one of them in different ways made the point to me, I'm the same person at work that I am at home, as a mother, as a wife, as a daughter, as a sister, in my community. I try to draw information from both my domestic life and my work life and use it and bring it back and forth rather than compartmentalizing. So they were avid about not compartmentalizing, which is really the message we've been hearing this morning, a message about personal integration. That was a characteristic of them. Now, what has been extraordinary for me is to watch over the last now 30 years. When these observations were made in 1990, these were not seen as mainstream leadership strengths at all. In fact, I found in the first couple of years I was talking, people said, you shouldn't talk about how skilled women are about relationships because relationships are the soft stuff. They're not the leadership stuff. Everything has changed. Because of the changes in technology, the nature of the economy and demographics, every single one of those skills, think about it, every single one of them has become more vital and more understood to be a major leadership capacity. Direct communication mandated by the technology. Being in the center of things, an enormous advantage in an environment where so much work is done in partnerships and webs and teams. Comfort with diversity, obviously a plus in an ever more diverse and globalized environment. Every one of these characteristics, integration of work and life in a 24/7 environment, an enormous capability. So it has been extraordinary to me to watch this happen and to watch this confluence of what organizations need in terms of leadership and what women have to provide. And it has given me optimism and faith through some fairly dark times, because that seems to me, you talk about an inflection point, you talk about a fulcrum, that seems to me to demonstrate that historical coincidence of when women came into the workplace and began achieving positions of leadership, overlapping with a change in our understanding of what great leadership requires.